This is Dr. Ron Sheveland. We're in the process of interviewing a number of individuals who are experienced in the area of church revitalization. And today we get the opportunity to talk to Dr. Paul D. Borden. This is a treat for me because I've known Paul for many years, and he's always impressed me with his passion for God, but also his competence in ministry. This is one of those individuals who really goes all out and through the power of God really does things right. And right now he's the executive minister of Growing Healthy Churches. That's a movement of churches in Northern California. He says this: our mission is growing healthy churches by networking, resourcing, and encouraging church leaders and congregations in the area of growth, health, transformation, and church planting. And that's exactly what they've been doing. Since 1997, over 170 congregations have experienced radical transformation. And as a result, many are intentionally and successfully reproducing new leaders and new disciples. And so you're going to discover in our interview that Paul has written several books on the topic of church revitalization, has worked with churches in his own movement, but has also worked with churches outside of his movement and with denominations and groups. So God's using him in a big way, and I think you'll find what he has to say very productive. Well, it's my privilege to be interviewing Paul Borden. I've known Paul through the years. I knew him back when he was a professor at Western Bible College, and then a pastor in Colorado, and a professor at Denver Seminary. And then, Paul, you went to Minnesota. You worked with Leith Anderson for a while, right?
Yeah, we had a grant from Leadership Network, and we created Teaching Church Network, which was basically getting larger congregations to mentor and disciple smaller congregations. And we did that for 3 years until the grant ran out. And then I came out here to Northern California to work with what was then called American Baptist Churches of the West. We have changed our name to Growing Healthy Churches.
And that's been an exciting adventure for you, Paul. And you really took a district, or you tend to call it a judicatory, is that right?
Well, actually, the term for our judicatory is a region.
Okay.
We had the northern half of California and northwest Nevada, and God did a miracle. From 97 through 2001, we went from less than 20% of our churches growing to over 70% growing. And then the last 10 years, God's let us plant about 100 congregations, which are now in 16 different states. And probably about a third of those congregations started with 200 or more people the first Sunday they met.
Yeah, that's exciting. Paul, you've helped the church at large with some of the books that you've written. Do you mind just sort of giving the titles a brief description as to what each one of them are about?
The first book was called Hit the Bullseye, which Tom Bandy really asked me to write to talk about our turnaround here in the first 5 years. And so really the book is about how do you turn around a judicatory, whether it's a region, a district, or whatever. And then I also wanted to write about how do you turn around a congregation, because the principles are the same. The second book is called Direct Hit. And after the first book came out, I had many pastors, particularly in smaller congregations, say, my district, my region is not going to help me. What do I do if I'm all by myself? And I really took John Cotter's first 4 steps of change. He says there's 8, but most change doesn't occur because nobody does the first 4. And I talked about how you do that in a local congregation, and it's really preparing a pastor and a congregation to be ready for change. The third book is called Assaulting the Gates, which is the strategy that we are seeing now for turnaround across denominations. It's really taking what God did here and saying, how can we help other denominations who don't want to be us, who aren't us, but is there a strategy that can be used? And we're finding it's working with great effectiveness. My newest book is entitled Make or Break Your Church in 365 Days. And I interviewed a number of transformational pastors and asked 2 questions. The first question is, what did you do the first year? And interestingly enough, I only came up with about 10 different common denominators of things they intentionally did. And then I said, what did you do Monday? What did you do Tuesday? What did you do Wednesday? And so I have a chapter on what a pastor does every day of the week in leading a turnaround in a congregation. So those are the 4 books.
You know, I've read your first 2 thoroughly. Your third one I just got, and the fourth one I just got. So I've just sort of breezed through that third one. The fourth one, I can't wait to get to it. It looks like it's so incredibly practical, down to earth, the nuts and bolts of how to do things. So they look like great books, Paul.
Well, thank you. It's been a much better response to the books than I thought. When I wrote my first one, I said I'd be happy if my children would buy it, and God has used it, and they've really been used by people across the country. And really, we work in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some other nations as well, and God's used them there.
Well, our goal in this interview is to try to just pump you for some information on doing church revitalization, both in individual churches, but also in working with different districts or regions of churches in helping them. So I assume you're going to share some of the materials that are primarily in books 2 and 3?
Primarily in number 3, because number 3 really lays out the strategy. The book is called Assaulting the Gates, and it is the threefold strategy we have used now with, in one way or another, with about 40 to 50 different denominational groups.
Great. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the process that you're using.
When I go into a region, a district, whatever, I talk to them about accountability. One of the things that God used in our turnaround was that we got very serious about accountability and saying if you do it well, there should be rewards. If you do it poorly, there should be consequences. However, in this day and age, you have to attract people to accountability. You can't command them to accountability. So I encourage a district to start with a group of 8, 10 congregations, or if they want to do it in groups, 3 or 4 groups of 10 congregations. And the first thing we do is we put the pastors in what we call clusters or learning communities. Now, these learning communities are not peer-led. They are led by an effective pastor who hopefully has more experience than any one other pastor who's in the group. They also do ask accountability, and they focus primarily on leadership and congregational health. How do you function as a leader, and what does it mean to be a healthy congregation? Now, we find that the learning communities really help the pastors, but they do not change congregations. And so that takes us to the second step of the strategy, where we say that every pastor represented in the learning community must have the congregation go through a congregational consultation. In that consultation, which is really in 2 parts, there is a weekend where we confront the church with what we believe are its best strengths, its biggest weaknesses, and then we write very specific prescriptions with deadlines for the weaknesses. We then give a congregation a month to think about it, pray about it, discuss it, but then they vote either to accept the prescriptions or not. If they don't, then we're done. We don't do anything else. If they do accept them, then the second part of the consultation is a year-long relationship with a congregational coach who helps them implement the prescriptions. So technically, the consultation is a year long. The third part of the strategy is during that year, while we're working with the pastors, we're doing the consultations, the pastors agree to get as many of their lay leaders to 2 events where we talk to them again about leadership and congregational health. So the whole strategy is based on a layered learning concept where what we talk about with the pastors in their learning communities, what we do in the consultations, and what we teach the laity is the same thing, time after time after time, because it takes numbers of times for congregations to begin to get it. As a result of this, we are finding that 50% on average of the congregations that get involved actually make systemic change, turn around, and begin to grow primarily through evangelism growth. So that in some cases it may be 40% in one denomination, in another denomination it may be 80%. But on average, half the congregations that get involved actually go through systemic change and begin to grow through evangelism growth.
Going back to that second phase of consultation, before you go in for the weekend, you must have them do some sort of self-study or questionnaire or something of that nature?
Yeah, we have them complete a self-study. It was really developed by Wooddale and Leith Anderson and was used originally with larger congregations. We used it with Teaching Church Network. It's been through several editions. It really isn't that long. It takes a congregation, at least a smaller congregation, usually a couple of months to get the information, pull it together, fill it in, and send it to us. I usually get that 2 weeks before we work with a congregation, and then we work with them all day Friday doing interviews, focus groups. Saturday we spend with the leaders, and then Sunday after the worship service we present the report with normally 5 strengths, 5 concerns, and 5 prescriptions.
Now I noticed in your book that in some churches there's enough distress and difficulties within the church that at that point you do more of what you call an intervention.
Yes, as we really work around the concept of congregational life cycles. Most congregations are on the downside of their life cycle. That's the phenomenon that's happening in the U.S. Therefore, we say that if a congregation has been on the downside of its life cycle 2, 3 years or longer, it is really, as a congregation, highly dysfunctional. And in a sense, it really is an intervention. I mean, we deal with very basic issues. The first issue we deal with is spiritual obedience. Jesus Christ said to make disciples. Most congregations are not making disciples, and so we tell them that they are spiritually disobedient to Jesus Christ. Therefore, the first prescription often is to take a worship service where the people literally get on their knees, pray, ask God to forgive them, because we believe that church transformation is ultimately a spiritual issue. It's not a matter of strategies and tactics, although you use them. It is a spiritual issue. So, yeah, we deal with some very basic issues.
That's great, Paul. The length of the process altogether. I mean, first of all, you get the clusters with the pastors. How long are they normally in clusters before their church might be involved in church consultation?
Well, I started a cluster a couple months ago with a particular denomination. We've already begun to schedule the church consultations. Usually it's 2 or 3 months because the first church has to work through the self-study. But it doesn't matter how long the pastor has been in the cluster. Now, obviously, those near the end, I talk about a year. We really go about 1.5 years, because those near the end, if their church agrees to do it, we need to work with them for 12 months. But it does not matter when they do it, because people ask me, when is a good time to do a church consultation? And for the most part, with some exceptions, any time is a good time to do it.
Okay. So overall, the process is about 1 year to 1.5 years for everything?
For everything. If we want to go through a cycle, by the time, let's say, the 10th congregation, if there are 10 pastors represented in the learning community, let's suppose they do it about the 10th, 11th month, then they have 1 year to work through their prescriptions. By the time that last congregation has completed it, we're looking probably somewhere between 18 to 20 months to do it at that point. Now, by the way, the learning communities continue on. I mean, we've been doing them in our region for 15 years, and we believe our pastors should be coming together every month for learning.
Can I ask what some of the topics are that you use in the development of your pastors during that time? Sure.
We talk about what's a healthy congregation look like. We deal with mission. We deal with vision. We deal with structure. How does governance impact the ability to do these things? We talk about specific ministries such as connection or assimilating new people into the congregation. We talk about preaching. We talk about how you do children's ministry, how you focus on reaching out into the community. But all of them are in some way related to helping that congregation quit focusing on themselves and become far more missional in its endeavor, in its relationship to the community.
Do you use any evaluation tools with the pastors themselves?
We don't normally do that in the cluster or learning communities, although that could happen. I find that most of the evaluation with pastors occurs while we're working with them one-on-one during the consultation process. I just did one recently, and on Friday morning I'm interviewing the pastor, and I said, "Do you have any resumes out?" And he said, "I do." I said, "Well, then you realize we can't continue this consultation until you and your wife decide whether you're going to stay or whether you're not going to stay, because why should we ask the congregation to go through all this if you're going to leave?" So we get down to those kinds of issues. If we think they need counseling, that may be a prescription. If we think they need some kind of coaching, and of course the congregational coach is trained to help the pastor develop in areas wherever she or he feels we feel they need development. The coach does that as well. So they're not only coaching the congregation, they're coaching the pastor as well.
I would think that one of the roadblocks that you'd be dealing with is just that some pastors are threatened, and you come in with a big process into the church. They feel either their agenda or perhaps their leadership is threatened. How do you deal with that issue?
Well, first of all, I tell every pastor when they enter this, I said the biggest change is not going to be in your congregation. The biggest change is going to be in you. However, for the first time, you're going to have the mentor who's leading the learning community. You're going to have a coach who is helping you. And normally, I want to do this in denominational settings where the regional exec or the district superintendent is coming to stand alongside the pastor. So I say, yes, it is a big challenge. But number one, for the first time, you're going to learn what your job really is. Number two, you're going to have help doing it. You're going to have people stand with you in terms of doing it. And so it is a challenge. It is threatening. But many of the pastors, as they come out the other side, say they would never have it any other way, because for the first time, and I have pastors tell me this all the time, for the first time, I'm doing ministry the way I thought I would do ministry before I went to seminary.
That's great.
You know.
That is super. And I love that partnership involved. I think the statistic that I read in your book was that only about 10% of pastors are really wired to be real leaders.
Yes.
And even those leaders can really be helped if they've got a partner from the outside coming along, helping with that process. What
we say to pastors is, really, if pastors represent the population, probably only 10% either have a gift for leadership or a talent for leadership. But we do say to pastors, you need to learn how to exercise leadership behavior. And we will help you exercise leadership behavior. That sometimes means taking risk. It sometimes means standing up to people. We will help you do that. And when you do it, you will have people being willing to take bullets for you, as it were, if there's trouble. But you're going to have to behave as a leader. So part of the whole coaching process is training pastors how to be leaders.
I do hear you. Thank you. Sorry for that.
No problem.
Yeah. I think I need a stronger graphics card in my computer. Sometimes my whole computer freezes up. But I think we're okay. So let's go back to where we were.
Okay.
I'm sure there's a lot of costs involved in this. Perhaps the minor cost is finances, but what are some of the costs that you see involved with something like this?
Well, there is the cost for leading the cluster. Although, let me say, when I work with denominations, my goal is to have leader pastors in there who will pick up and take over leading the cluster once I'm done, usually from the denomination. So my cost normally is about $1,200 a day. When I do a consultation with a smaller congregation, the cost is normally $5,000 for the weekend. All of this is obviously plus expenses. The coaches cost normally somewhere between $200 to $300 a month, because they're usually on the campus of the congregation at least for one day. And when that happens, sometimes the cost goes up. However, let me also say that if a congregation and a pastor is not paying part of those costs, to the denomination or whomever, we find it doesn't work as well. So we encourage churches to pick up half of the consulting costs, usually pick up some of the cost of being in the learning cluster, picking up some of the coaching costs, and the denomination to pick some up. So often, whatever the costs are involved, the cost, let's say, to a denomination is normally about half of the cost because of what the congregations are picking up. All of that is done, however, to train people within the denomination to do it. So, for example, for about the last 7 years, I've been working with the Salvation Army in Australia. Now, I'm only there once or twice a year. They have worked with 50 congregations over the last 5 years, doing the consultations, doing the learning communities, etc. They have seen 50% of their congregations turn around, and all of that has been done for the most part by leaders within the Army that we have trained.
Okay. All right. So when it comes to the facilitators, if you were to work with another group, a denomination, you'd go in and train their facilitators.
Yeah, we actually, first of all, right now, the one I'm doing, I'm training up the next leader to lead the learning community. That person is there every meeting. We're working together. We talk about it before and after the meeting, how to do it. Almost every time I do a consultation, I will have 4, 5, 6 people with me. So they are watching what's going on. There are times when I actually sit there and let them do the consultation. It's kind of the old idea. They watch me, and then, I watch them, and then we let them do it. So there is constant training. That's why I want to do it with a denomination much more than, say, a one-off relationship with a congregation, because at that point it doesn't work as well. It works better when we're helping some, whether it's a region, a district, whatever, work, because we have the resources to do that.
Now, Paul, as you know, the group that I work with, Converge, has become very culturally diverse. It started with a bunch of Swedish Baptists, and it's now become more like it. But I'm assuming that's the very same case with Growing Healthy Churches in Northern California.
Well, obviously, because we're in Northern California, we're much more multicultural than a lot of denominations.
Yes.
And I can say that in our region, we have seen turnaround with African American churches. We have seen turnaround with Asian churches. In fact, my favorite story is an Asian church that's Chinese. When the pastor went there, they had an English congregation. They now have English, Cantonese, Mandarin, and Hispanic congregations there. We have seen it happen with Hispanic congregations. Now, there are unique things that have to be worked out in terms of the cultural differences, and I realize I'm not an expert on those cultural differences, but the systemic bottom line problems are the same regardless of the ethnicity or the cultural background. I worked with a Salvation Army church in Sydney that was basically 70 older white people in the most multicultural center of Sydney. The church at one time had been 500. It's down to 70. 2 years later, they were averaging 166 in worship. 37 nations were involved in the church, wow. And they had seen 40 people come to Christ that year. So the problems are the same. In fact, I think often ethnicity is used as an excuse, regardless of the ethnicity, not to make the changes that need to be made.
Yeah, it seems as though